Okay. Uh, I can't really say good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. And welcome to At Some Point You Rose and Now We Will Shine Together. I'm Brendan. Most of you know me at this point by now. Um, and we are on Mark 5 and 6 in the reading plan. We finished Matthew, I think it was right at the beginning of this week. And now we are into Mark. If you're following along with us in the reading plan, which you totally should. It's been pretty helpful, beneficial to kind of be paying attention to it. If you haven't looked into Mark a lot before, I really like the Gospel of Mark for a couple reasons. One, we know a little bit about the author. If you've read in Acts, John Mark is the author of the Gospel of Mark, and so you can see some of his interactions with Paul and Barnabas in Acts, and he's referenced in a couple of his letters. But secondly, I really like Mark because they think that John Mark's primary interviewee that he gets his information for this gospel is Peter, the disciple Peter. When I read through Mark, I often think of it as, okay, this is Peter's account of the gospel, and you see kind of this like Mark writes very action oriented. He describes a lot of doing things and a lot of emotions, and he doesn't have kind of the longer theological teachings that some of the other gospels feature. And that just kind of feels like Peter, right? He's like, let's skip over the big Sermon on the Mount, huge 3-chapter teaching. Let's get to Jesus doing stuff. I have no idea if that's really what happened. That's how I prefer to read it. There's a lot going on in Mark 5 and 6. And I just want to focus on really the last part of Mark 6. It's Jesus walking on the water. This is a very familiar story to a lot of people that have read the Bible before. So maybe you've read it before, but that doesn't mean that there's not something for it. In fact, I often try to, when there's a passage I'm reading that I've definitely read before, I try to pay even closer attention so I don't just assume I know what's going on here. So I'm going to read it to you. I'm reading in the NIV, and then I'll just offer a few thoughts. So starting Mark 6 in verse 45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, referring to the feeding of the 5,000 that has just happened. Their hearts were hardened. When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. It's a cool story. And I'm just going to point out to you, I don't necessarily have like a single landing point I want to talk about, just a couple of things that have stuck out to me as I was reading this, frankly, this morning. First thing I notice, actually, and this is going to be out of chronological order, if you're familiar with this story because it's told in the other Gospels, you may be noticing something's missing here. It's kind of a big deal in this story. It's that in the other accounts, Peter walks on the water. He calls out to Jesus and he says, "Lord, if it's you, let me walk to you." And then he walks, and then he gets scared and he sinks. And Jesus says, like, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" And it's interesting that in the account that I think comes from Peter's telling of it, he chooses not to include that. Is it to not exalt himself? Is it to say like, hey, I want Jesus to be the priority of the story? Is it because if he's embarrassed of the sinking into the water part? No idea. I think it's interesting. But I have no idea why he wouldn't include that, because it seems like a pretty big deal. But I just got to acknowledge it's the first thing I noticed. But now let me start kind of in the beginning of this and walk through verse by verse. So Jesus has just fed the 5,000, this miracle where he takes a couple loaves of bread and a couple fish and he feeds, well, 5,000 men, probably more like 10 or 12,000 people. And it says immediately after that, Jesus makes the disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him. So he says, all right, you guys, you're going to go on ahead to the next place we're going to go. I'm going to stay and pray. I don't think that we should ignore the fact that Jesus seems to put a high priority on himself getting some time to pray alone and in quiet. But we've talked about that on this stream before, so that hopefully isn't a new idea for you guys. But what's interesting to me as I'm reading through this, in verse 48, it says, he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. So Jesus sends the disciples out to go to kind of their next destination across the lake, and they're just going straight into a wind. And it says that they're struggling, they're straining. Jesus sent them to do this, which is interesting. In some ways, I assume he knows that they were going to be facing difficult weather, and he sent them to kind of strain forward. It looks like they're not making progress. And then Jesus just kind of is strolling on the lake, walking past him kind of casually, right? It doesn't describe the same type of effort that the disciples are going through. It just says Jesus is walking out to them on the lake. And it says he's going to pass them by, which is like, what was Jesus just going to wait for them to struggle out there? And I don't think it's quite that. I mean, it says he saw that they were straining at the oars, so he noticed their difficulty. I think it's interesting that it says he was going to pass them by until the disciples saw him walking, and then they cried out. I think there's something there that I've noticed in other places in scripture and in some other thoughts that I've had about God, that God will often let us struggle until we call out to him. That God is willing to let us do our own thing, but he wants us to call out and ask him for help. Again, I don't know what Jesus's motivations were here, but I know he saw them struggling, but didn't go towards them until they cried out. And what's interesting is that they didn't actually cry out knowing it was Jesus immediately. They just acknowledged him and were terrified. But then Jesus immediately speaks to them and says, take courage. In another translation, it says, be of good cheer. It is I, don't be afraid. And then he climbs into the boat with them. And then it says, well, in other translations, it says that they had instantly been transported over. If you look, that like almost like miraculously, whether it was the winds changed direction or even more so, they were like kind of instantly there. But Jesus solves the issues and they cross over. And I have to wonder, like, why would Jesus send them out to struggle against the oars only for him to get in the boat later and be like, boom, I'm done. I've taken you there. And again, I think he's teaching the disciples something. I think he's saying like, hey, it's not actually about you. I wonder if he's telling Peter here. And, all the disciples, but Peter is maybe the most brash and action-oriented of all of them. And then Peter telling this story as this is what I got out of this. If he's telling Peter, like, you can struggle all you want, the boat's not going anywhere until I get into it. And I think it's interesting, too, that when they cross over, they landed, and immediately what happens? Jesus gets out, and he starts healing people miraculously. I wonder if the disciples were thinking that the story was about them. I mean, we certainly see later, I think the last time I shared on Rise and Shine, you see James and John and their mother trying to get Jesus to like name them as top dog in God's kingdom. And Jesus is like, that's not how it works. I wonder if the disciples thought they were a little too close to the story. And Jesus is like, this isn't about you. That miracle of sharing the loaves and the fish, that wasn't about you. And this isn't about you. You can row all you want, but it's not until I get in the boat that things are going to happen. And we're going to go somewhere, and then I'm going to do more miracles. And the disciples get to be along for the ride. Jesus is choosing to let them be a part of his mission. And I say all that because I think that applies to me too. And maybe you would say it applies to you guys as well. That we often try to row the boat into the wind, and we think that if we just row hard enough, we're going to get there. And it's not until we kind of in fear, acknowledge that we need help and let Jesus get into the boat, that we're going to instantly cross over to the other side and see Jesus miraculously do things, not because of anything that we've done, but because he is choosing to have compassion on people. And that's tough, especially thinking right now. I mean, if you're like me, you're thinking about what the fall is going to look like. For those of you that are Miami students or Navigator staff, we're thinking about like, okay, how are we going to plan and make the best possible thing for the fall with these different restrictions and preparing for COVID-19? And that's good. We should prepare. Jesus did tell the disciples to row across the lake and work at it. They wouldn't have gotten Jesus into the boat if they hadn't gotten into the boat. But I think as you're planning for classes, or you're thinking about the next internship you're going to get, or you're trying to plan for that career, don't lose sight of the fact that Jesus getting into the boat is what's going to get you across the lake. And maybe not to do what you had planned, but to do what he had planned. And if you want to be a part of that story and be a part of that kingdom, I think, like Peter, we need to recognize that the story isn't about us, no matter what happens to or around us. It's about Jesus. And that takes humility on all of our parts. I struggle with that all the time. I love thinking the story is about me, or if not about me, then I'm like a real key minor character. Like I'm going to win the Academy Award for supporting actor. And that's not it. It's Jesus' story. It's about him. And it's only by his grace that I'm allowed to have a role. I guess I did kind of have a key landing thought that I was going to come down on. I wonder if you guys see some of those same things there too. If you're in the Discord, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts from any of these two chapters. And again, if this is your first video, you haven't watched in a while, follow our reading plan. There's information about it kind of at the beginning. And if you're, again, in our Discord or on our emails, we've sent out the reading plan. It makes a difference to be reading a little bit about Jesus every day. It's not too late to jump in just with Mark. Even if you missed the part we were going through Matthew, it could be really meaningful. I'm going to pray, and then I'll close this Rise and Shine Late Riser edition. Father, I so often think that I'm the center of this story, that my life is about me. But you tell me that my life is not my own, that I was rescued with a price that I was paid for. But I wasn't just paid for to do my own thing. I was paid for a purpose, that you call me to serve your kingdom and serve your son. That the story is about him, and I have a role to play, but only because you've given it to me. So would I see what I'm supposed to do? Would I see the opportunities to let Jesus into my life and let him drive things, let him change people's lives? And would I just have the joy of experiencing that, of getting out of the way and seeing you do things that are miraculous, God, seeing you change and heal and better people? We ask this in your son's name. Amen. Thanks, guys. Would love to hear some thoughts from you guys. Hopefully you're having a good week. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday, actually at 10 a.m. that time.